Good afternoon, everyone, or at least here in Washington, D.C. Good morning and good evening if you're in other time zones. My name is Aaron Danis. I'm a faculty member at the National Intelligence University here in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the panel, The Ethics of Wargaming, which is really on par with the theme for the whole conference. We're fortunate today that we have on our panel Dr. Stephen Downes-Martin with the impressive headset that he has, and Dr. Ruby Booth. Apologies, but Miss Aggie Hurst had to withdraw from the panel. And I'm going to give some shortened bios. The panelists' full bios are available on the conference app. We'll start out with Ruby first. She is a cybersecurity researcher specializing in the interaction between human behavior and cybersecurity. Her research includes works on hacker motivation, InfoSec culture, and the effect of security breaches on user behavior. Dr. Booth is a principal member of the technical staff at Sandia National Laboratories, where she serves as a national security systems analyst and cybersecurity subject matter expert. Her areas of interest include cyber risk management, consequence assessment, and cyber deterrence investment strategy. She has a PhD in business administration with a concentration in MIS. Dr. Stephen Downes-Martin is a research fellow at the U.S. Naval War College and is an independent scholar researching the use and abuse of decision support tools such as wargaming at the strategic, operational, and tactical levels of both warfare and business. His current research focuses on how to manipulate wargaming to deceive sponsors and other decision makers, how decision makers deceive themselves and allow themselves to be deceived, how to detect such manipulation and protect decision makers from them. His formal education includes a PhD in relativistic quantum field theory from King's College, London University. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ruby to kick us off. Thank you for coming.
Hey, yes, so thank you so much for having me. As Aaron said, I am a cybersecurity systems analyst at Sandia National Labs, but I do want to be clear that I don't speak for Sandia. I don't speak for the U.S. government. My thoughts, particularly in this panel, are my own. That said, I have done gaming work at Sandia. I'm part of the Pegasus group, and I've also have a background of about more than a decade of hobby games. And so I come at this from a little bit of a different perspective, I think, than some folks within the community, and I'm excited to be here. I don't have slides or anything. I really just wanted to talk about the ways that ethics impacts war games and ways that I think that we should be thinking and talking about some of these things. So I see it as having a number of implications and implications in different contexts. So when we start talking about ethics, ethics means a lot of things to a lot of people, and it means a lot of things in different contexts, right? But I sort of, when I think about war games, I think about ethics as we apply it to our designers, ethics as we apply it to the game design itself, ethics as it is applied to player recruitment and sort of interaction with players, ethics as it relates to the purpose of the game and the use of the game, and then ethics when it comes to sharing the information that we derive from the games. So in terms of ethics within the design community, I think that there's some wonderful work being done. The Derby House principles are a good example of this, of trying to make the community inclusive, to make it receptive to others, to really have a rigorous approach to the ways that we set standards, offer opportunities, and provide access to the activities. So that's good. We're in a good, it's a good start, but the overall community, the Derby House principles aren't, they're an optional sign-on. They're not something that has been adopted by the community as a professional standard of practice in the way that you do see in some other industries. And so, coming from a cybersecurity background where you have to sign on in order to get certifications, in order to get recognition within the field, you have to sign on to very specific ethical guidelines. It's interesting to come into a field where there's obviously this, excellent intention, and there's a community here that really cares about these things, but it hasn't been promulgated across the field as a as a requirement to claim the professional status. I'm not saying that we should necessarily make it a requirement, but I'm saying that these broader conversations that we're having, for instance, having a giant conference, the main theme of which is ethics, is a good start for us as a design community. Moving into the design itself, and this is something that I think Stephen will talk more about, there are ways that we can design games where the games themselves are more or less ethical. We can design manipulative games. And so I sort of think about it in terms of minimally manipulative design. So obviously, in order to achieve our goals, we really have to manipulate, right? We have to pick norms. We have to pick realities that we adhere to or not. We literally design rules around what players can do and can't do. There are manipulations there. And then when you're doing experimental design, as a lot of the groups that, as the folks that I work with tend to do, that's its own kind of manipulation. You're literally manipulating an independent variable. That said, there's manipulation that doesn't serve direct purposes or that isn't explicit, that we don't share with our participants, that I think should be avoided. And I know that Stephen has looked in depth into that, and so I won't belabor the point. In design, I've made, I had another talk earlier in Connections about human subjects research and the idea that war games as applied in an analytical sense or in terms of political science or international relations constitute human subjects research. We are running games and gathering data based on human behavior and then writing it up and writing up theories. And so the application of the Belmont principles, I think, is a really important part of where we should be pushing our ethics work in terms of design. We need to make sure that we're adhering to respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And I've said in another talk that I think that we're doing a good job with the first two, but that we could really look at ways in which we could improve some of the ways that we enact justice. And I mean justice from the sense of the research having just outcomes, not that we model worlds that have ideal justice, because that's not, our games model reality. And I think we all acknowledge that the world could have a little bit more justice, we would be a little bit more even-handed. It's not imperfect. We don't live in a utopia. Player recruitment is another area. So this is something where the Belmont Principles and Justice comes in again about making games accessible. I really see an opportunity here for Derby House principle style guidance, where we try and recruit from more diverse groups. And I've talked a little bit about that with some folks at the conference, but basically this idea that the wargaming community, even participants in wargaming, we don't always do a great job of reaching out to people who don't look like us and come from our same backgrounds. I think the teaching outreach methods is something important for those of us who have backgrounds in reaching underrepresented groups. I think that we have an obligation to share those with folks that have less experience. That's something I'm happy to be a resource for people who are looking to get the word out about wargaming and try and bring in wargame designers and wargame participants from other groups. And I think we also have to counter misperceptions within our own community and implicit biases that we may have. For instance, I think there's a kind of implicit assumption with some people that that women like a particular kind of game, or that that some groups like war games more than others. And I mean, I think some of that is exposure, and some of that is how receptive the community is to other folks. For purpose and use, I think first of all, I want to acknowledge that games are multi-purpose, that not everybody in this room and not everybody watching on YouTube later is thinking about war games for the same purpose. Somebody said to me yesterday that war games are for making commanders. So okay, well, there are definitely war games that are designed to teach commanders, teach military personnel to be commanders, but not all war games are for that. We, in my group, we use war games to study conflict theory, right? And they're still war games, so we're still part of the community. And conversely, right? Like we can't, those of us who are doing experimental design really can't say, oh, well, you have to have an experimental war game, or you have to have a qualitative data collection, or you're not doing the thing. Like, there are war games that are training games, and that's a perfectly viable and useful place for that. But I do think that we need to be responsible about that use. So we need to be responsible about the goals that we set, and we need to be responsible about the claims that we make about the ability of the games to achieve those goals. And then finally, when we do all this work, we need to share what we learn. And that's why conferences like Connections and conferences like Moores are really useful, because we do have the opportunity to share across the community. But also, I think that there's some sections of our community that publish a lot because they work in more academic settings and they have the time, they have the incentives for that. But it would be nice if we shared more across the various groups. And I don't really know how to incentivize that, because everybody's busy, everybody has day jobs, everybody has goals. And if your job doesn't incentivize publication, then I don't know how we get there, but maybe collaboration across groups would be a way to do that. I think we could also do more teaching as a group, and we can try and collaborate across the areas of wargaming, because we collaborate within our little clusters, but I think sometimes we, those of us that view it as, say, a training set, and those of us that view it as an experimental set may not work together. And I've seen really great work. Some of the stuff that I've had the privilege to do with NATO has really shown me that you can sometimes do both in a way that's really meaningful and yields interesting results. So that's kind of how I frame it and how I think about it. And now I'm going to turn it over to Stephen to talk about his approach.
If I can find my unmute button. Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Ruby. Are we sharing my slide that I sent you?
Don't see them yet, but hopefully our producer can pull them up if necessary.
Okay, well, I'll share it then myself. No, let's see if I can do this. Share screen. No.
I think I have them. I could push them to.
I thought that's how we were going to do it. Is it sharing now?
Yes.
Is it sharing? Okay. So let me just. My apologies for this, everybody. Okay, that's a little better. So, first of all, where have you been all my life, Ruby? Because you've been describing the stuff that I've been struggling with for some time. And so, bad luck you. I'm going to track you down and talk to you a lot after this.
I'm excited about that.
After this conference. So some time back, I was doing some research into deception. In a previous life, I was an intelligence officer in the British version, I suppose, of the US National Guard. And we were doing a lot of practical stuff looking at deception. And then a few years back at the War College, I started thinking about deception. And I asked myself the question, because we were arguing a lot about good wargaming. How do we do effective wargaming? How do we do good wargaming? So I asked myself, well, why don't we turn the question around and ask ourselves what would happen if we deliberately try to design a game to deceive the sponsor? Not deceive a stupid sponsor, but an intelligent sponsor who takes away from the game the information that he or she believes is sort of good stuff and uses that to influence their decision. It's a thought experiment, not because we wish to do that, but because what we're interested in is understanding wargame principles, things not to do, things to look out for, which we might not discover simply looking at best practices, simply looking at what went wrong with a game that we tried to do right. Instead, ask ourselves what went right with a game we tried to do wrong. And so you have to ask yourself, well, okay, and my boss at the time said, Stephen, why would we want to do this? I can't imagine anybody doing that. And there's this pause, and he says, except for contractors. And I looked at him and I said 2 words, Fat Leonard. So for those of you who are not Americans, Fat Leonard is a scandal in which a slew of admirals and O6s were being investigated and prosecuted for corruption. In Canada, I think the word is Langevin, the contractor that has created political problems for very senior people, and so on. It's a vulnerability that everyone has. Now, that book on the left by David Goodstein, Provost of Caltech, Vice Provost of Caltech, one of his jobs was investigating intellectual fraud. And that's the term they use, academic or intellectual fraud. And that took place within the University of California system. And he discovered 3 criteria that tended to be present whenever intellectual fraud was happening. The perpetrators knew or thought they already knew the answer. They didn't, doing the experiment, running the investigation was a formality only. Okay, and if there's a difference between the formality of the experiment and what they know is right, predominates. So they thought they knew what the answer was. They're under career pressure and are working in a field, and this is critical, where individual experiments are not expected to be precisely reproducible. That pretty much describes wargaming. Okay. One of the things we say about wargaming all the time is they're not reproducible, they're not repeatable. The games that I'm talking about are games in which senior officers, flag and general officers, and O6s, colonels, and Navy captains, and Marine captains, colonels, etc., are playing. They tend to be analytic. Everything I'm saying is driven by my interest in analytic wargaming. However, it's probably applicable to training, education, experiential socialization games, and so on. So absolutely, in a war game, you have senior officers. They're under career pressure. If you're doing a very serious game, how you perform on the game and what the game says. If you're a Navy admiral in a war game that deals with aircraft carriers and the carriers end up looking bad compared to air power, trust me, that has an effect on your career. And we've seen admirals in war games trying to fudge the game and manipulate the game and intimidate the adjudicators and so on. We've also seen admirals doing the opposite, learning from those games. But there's a vulnerability there. So they're under career pressure. War games are not, generally speaking, repeatable. And most senior people, myself included, although I'm not particularly senior, are not known for their lack of self-confidence. They believe in themselves. By the way, I come from an English background, so it's not unknown for us not to avoid using double negatives. Anyway, so here's the vulnerability. You've got no choice but to actually consider that these people are subject, either vulnerable to deliberately manipulating the system or self-deception. The top right of my slide there actually ties in very nicely to what Ruby's been talking about. Back in 2004, we discussed at the War College the inner game and the outer game. That's just the labels we gave them. The inner game is what we always think about when we talk about wargaming. That's when everyone gets together, they get in their cells, they make moves and so on. But that inner game is embedded in an outer game. The outer game is played by the sponsor, the wargame designer, other stakeholders, and all too often a bunch of senior players who are both playing in the outer game and either have been invited to play or have inserted themselves inside the inner game. Okay, so any kind of unethical behavior in the outer game will tend to absolutely dominate the inner game because it nudges and influences the wargame design. It nudges and influences the analysis that follows the war game, the interpretation of what happened in the war game, the writing of the war game report, and then the promulgation of that report up the chain of command. So you cycle around that outer game, producing an inner game each time. The inner game may very well change design as your understanding of a problem changes, and so on. So absolutely, we have an issue there. No amount of brilliant, ethical, inner wargame design will save you if your outer game is corrupted. Okay. Flip side of that is, of course, if your however good your outer game is, if you can manipulate the inner game, you can influence the final results. So I've one final point, and then we can talk about actual techniques. In the kind of games I'm talking about, senior officers are brought in for a week-long game dealing with serious national security related issues. Get it wrong, people are going to die. These are very serious and intelligent people. They're not gamers. They have very low tolerance for coming in and learning a bunch of rules and rolling dice and moving counters along tracks. Some of them are, okay? But even the ones that are, every part of the game tends to be dominated by discussion. Okay, most of these war games that I'm dealing with are discussion based. They're seminar based, they're matrix games. Even when there's a map laid out and it looks like a board game, the officers are standing around it discussing what they're going to do. And the psychology, the group psychology of small groups having discussions absolutely plays here. So we'll start with that group dynamic on the bottom left, the rule of 8. It's an observation I made about 20 years ago, and you can do it yourself now. And by the way, I think it's the Baader-Meinhof effect, where once something is mentioned to you, you'll see it all the time. So you start doing this now. Next time you're in a meeting with more than 8 people, count how many people actually contribute something substantial to the meeting. It's pretty tightly bound around the number 8. Occasionally, a few extra people will throw the odd comment in. Sometimes that group of 8 will morph into an overlapping group of 8, and all that says is the meeting has changed. So how would I manipulate? So with that observation in mind, I'm not going to go through in detail all of these, but here's an example here. With that observation in mind, if I wanted to absolutely dominate a discussion without people realizing what I've done, I will be inclusive. I will invite everyone to my discussion. I would invite, especially the people who don't agree with me. The last thing I want is those people in another room plotting against me. I want them in my room. And I want more than 8. I want about 24 people in there. We'll get everybody together and have this disciplined process. Only I and 7 of my buddies have got together and agreed. And when we walk in and the meeting starts, we make sure that us 8 speak early and often. We're not brutal about it, but we just really start edging in. After the first few of us have nudged in, once the 8 of us have each bounced around, I talk to Fred, Fred talks back to me, you ignore someone who speaks up that is not part of your 8. Once the 8 of you have spoken, the tendency is the rest of the people will sit there taking notes and not actually enter the discussion. And the result of that discussion will be whatever direction you, with your team of 8, want it driven in. So this is a game, remember. So Stephen has pulled them all in together because Stephen has an idea about how this should work in the early stages of discussion with the sponsor and all the stakeholders. You, who've been to one of my seminars, promptly stick your hand up and say, no, let's break the groups up into subgroups of 8 and operate in parallel. Okay. What do I do with my 8? I want all my 8 in one group. So it's one group amongst, say, 3 or 4. Or do I split my guys up and gals up and spread them around, in which case they can't dominate the subgroups? So you cut that one off at the knees. And breaking them up into subgroups is really quite important. We'll jump down to wisdom of crowds or all too often the madness of mobs. Someone will claim, well, having a crowd is just much better. Wisdom of crowds, we should get them all in together. And if that happens, I do my 8. But remember about the wisdom of crowds, it only works if there are 4 criteria that are satisfied, okay? Diversity of opinion, I'm going to just check that I have them right here. Independence of opinion, decentralization, and the aggregation method by which you combine the results. Remember, by the way, the wisdom of crowds does not say large group of people comes up with a better answer than a small group or a large group than one person. It's utterly ridiculous to say that 10 idiots will have a better answer than one expert, or 10 sanitation engineers will have a better oncology regime for me than my one oncology expert. What it says is that in a large group of experts, their average opinion of a numeric quantity, okay, is more likely to be closer to the actual number than any randomly selected member of that group, even if some of those group members are bang on target. Remember, probability and random selection. So again, you can really muck up the wisdom of crowds by breaking those 4 criteria. You select senior people with opinions you prefer, invite junior people, especially from organizations whose opinions you don't like. So you make sure that the independence is broken. Allow undisciplined brainstorming, and when it's time to vote, okay, you allow sequential voting. In other words, senior people go first and they put their yellow sticky up and the juniors follow. You know, you're golden. You're golden if you do that. Then you use junk arithmetic to aggregate. Anytime you're in a wargame design discussion and there's a disagreement and someone suggests a voting scheme, you're golden. Every voting scheme can be manipulated. And in an entirely different class of presentations, I talk about each one of those and how to do it. So again, you break this by subdividing the crowd, so it's not a large crowd, and you put 1 person in charge of each subgroup of 8. That person is named and held accountable for the product. And that helps defeat one of the problems in this group dynamic near the bottom, the dishonesty shift. Psychology research has shown that group discussion shifts a group away from their ethical norms further than the individuals would have preferred to go if they weren't in a discussion. And that can be manipulated, but you get around it by the only way it's known of getting around it is to remind people of the ethical norms of their organization before each discussion and hold one person, named person, accountable for the ethics of the decision that's made. And that tends to work. Keep an eye on the time here. I'm going to now move on to the risky shift. There's a shift in risk averseness and seeking once a group gets together and has a conversation. Brainstorming and bogsats, a bunch of guys sitting around and talking is bogsat. I like AWACS, arm waving and chatter session. And my favorite is BUMMO, B-U-M-M-O. It sounds manly because it has the word bum in it. It stands for bogsat until a miracle occurs. And trust me, miracles never occur just because you keep doing the same poor quality process. Brainstorming was introduced in the 50s. Claims were made about it. Social scientists at the time said, oh, those claims are testable. They tested them and debunked them. Okay. Brainstorming has been debunked over and over and over again for over half a century. I have no idea by senior officers. Well, I'm sorry, it's pure laziness, intellectual laziness. We'll sit around and chat, and somehow our undisciplined chat generates goodness. No, it doesn't. Replace it with a 3-stage normative process. Let's talk about gender ratios. These are fascinating, okay? 20 plus years ago, a colleague of mine said to me one day, Stephen, you know, the performance of a small group is critically dependent, all else being equal. Remember everything I was saying up to this point, all else being equal, it's critically dependent on the ratio of genders in that group. Oh, says I, because I'm not very bright. You mean more women, the better it is? No, he said, there's like a sweet spot, or rather there's a dip. If you get the ratio wrong, the group becomes dysfunctional. I just moved on to other stuff. And 2 years ago, I spoke to a professor at the Watson Institute here. She does gender studies, and she also consults with US Special Forces Command. Very tough-minded woman, very intelligent, very bright. And I asked her about this. And she told me something that seems to fit in with something that Sally Davis wrote about on Paxims recently. She told me that in a small group, again, all else being equal, if the women make up less than 30%, less than a third rather, okay, they tend not to push themselves forward. They tend to be retiring. What's the opposite of retiring? They tend not to be emphatic and have their say. Once they get above 30%, a third rather, they become emphatic. They self-confident. They make their say. Not necessarily as a group, but as individuals. However, and this is critical, unless they are in the majority, all else being equal, that caveat, the men tend to ignore them. So if you put together a group, small group discussion of between a third and a half women, the likelihood is that group is going to perform badly. The women are going to be pushy and the men are going to ignore them. So how do you want your group, if you have a mixed group, gender group, and you're going to divide them up into your 8 or smaller number, how do you want them? Do you want them to perform well, or do you want them to perform badly? If I want to appear to be terribly inclusive, and I have a minority of women in the group, and in my business they do tend to be in the minority, more is the shame. If I wanted to pretend to be inclusive but disenfranchise them, I'd put 1 or 2 women in every group. Look, I'm spreading you around. Every group is diverse, thus guaranteeing that, all else being equal, the women in the group do not have their voices heard. If the women in the group, if I've got a group of men who are strong-minded and their opinions are opposite mine, I'll put them in a group in which there's more than a third women, but less than a half. And that will tend to disrupt their discussions. If the women, I've got a group of women whose opinions I like, I'll ensure, if I can, that they are the majority of a group. So this business of gender ratio is very interesting and can be manipulated every which way. Sally Davis pointed out that when women talk about 17% of the time, if I'm not misquoting her, men tend to view them as dominating the conversation. But there's probably a whole bunch of other issues here. There's a book, The Silent Sex. I forget the authors. Ruby probably has it at her fingertips, has memorized it backwards. Fascinating, well worth reading, slightly different focus than what we're interested here, but absolutely required reading. So we have the threat, intellectual fraud driven by career risk, unrepeatability and overconfidence in the people engaged. We have this whole bunch of dynamics that can be used, you can fall into inadvertently. Not every technique I've just described for mucking things up has to be done deliberately. I've seen people do it inadvertently. I've seen every one of the poor behaviors described here carried out by senior civilian and military officers, by the way, every single one. The root cause of this actually creating a problem is our lack as wargamers of ethics, competence, and courage. Okay, we have to take the ethical the probity of our games seriously and be willing to speak up and push back against what I have called the three witches of wargaming in a previous publication. You have to understand the ethics, you have to be competent. There's no point in not being competent because you can then be dismissed. And you have to be competent at a wide range of topics. If you're wargaming, you're doing social science. You better really understand not just how to do the war game itself, but group psychology, decision analysis, a whole bunch of other topics in there. You have to focus on the sponsor objectives. You have to have the moral courage to, if necessary, put your career at risk to tell the truth. So over to you.
All right, thank you. We do have a few questions queued up. The first one is professional, and this kind of digs down, I think, a little bit on your diagram, more into kind of the subset of the players. Professional war games have 2 or more players, often with a white cell. How are the ethical pitfalls different between the players, blue, red, green, and the controllers? And I say that with the fact that at the same time that we're talking, there is another panel talking about the ethics of OPFOR going on as we speak. So we can even delve into that a bit. Maybe we can listen in on a little bit. Who knows? So anybody want to jump on that first one? Differences between the actual players ethically.
Why don't you go, Ruby, since they've listened to me long enough?
Well, I'm not sure about different player roles, whether or not there are strong ethical differences, but I do think one of the things that I brought up in another talk is player motivation can really lead to unethical behavior, and that comes in when we get into this gamers mode phenomenon where people want to win at all costs. And as Stephen said, these games can have really profound reputational effects for for people's careers. And so there is a desire to win, and sometimes the desire to win or just sort of one up can really get in the way of playing the game as not just as intended, but sort of following the mechanics of the game and thus generating useful generalizable information. And so we see that a lot, and we have some sort of ways of trying to control for it around surveys before and after and observations. But it is a core problem, and I've heard people tell stories about large scale war games where I've seen it come up a lot. And I think that there are things that we can do within the game running that can diminish or exacerbate that. One is I think inexperienced war game runners, not necessarily war game designers, can be too responsive. The world itself is not terribly responsive to us. And I mean, we've all seen cases where SIPRNet or whatever the local equivalent of it is down, where commanders don't communicate clearly or don't communicate quickly. And so we can sort of use those within a game as a mechanism for kind of softening those effects from players. From a controller perspective, I think that one of the predominant things that I learned from my hobby game design and practice was that there was really there is a desire to force the game to run, not necessarily a conscious or deliberate intention, but there's a desire just for ease, even to force the game to run the way you expected it to, and or the way that you think your sponsor would want to Stephen, some of Stephen's points. And so that willingness to see findings that don't exactly match what you wanted or expected is a really important process, and that can be something that we keep implicitly in our minds. And so I think explicitly going into situations and saying, okay, I think that we might get these findings, but if I start seeing X, Y, or Z, then that may be an indication that this is going to go not off the rails, but in a different direction, and I need to be prepared for that. And so if you sort of prime yourself, then I think that can be beneficial.
Ruby, that's a great point. I think we've all been in games where things have gone off the rails, and you see the controllers scrambling around saying, "This was not what we envisioned. How do we get it back on to where we need to get to our preordained conclusion here?" So it may be just the pressure of running the game can force that. So, Stephen.
Yeah.
Yes. So let me address that earlier question. The players themselves are playing a game. The game has rules. I'm never angry or upset when the player spots a loophole in the rules and exploits it. That's information back to the game designer to do a better job next time. At the same time, you cannot have rules that cover every possible conceivable contingency. And so there's this balance between, I've seen I can remember as a 10-year-old school kid playing soccer, the goalkeeper is allowed to pick the ball up. You're not allowed to handle the ball. Well, my hands aren't on the ball when I pull my sweater up and he tucks it under my sweater and I go running down the field. I was not breaking the rules. I spotted that loophole. However, I did have to do bunny hops around the pitch afterwards. So, there you go. The controller, however, I think the word was controllers, wasn't it, or white cell in the question. If it's an inductive game, the controllers, the adjudicators, I'll use the word, are themselves game players. They are Uber players. What they're doing is they're taking the red move and the blue move and deciding what the outcome is going to be. If all they're doing is rolling dice against a combat results table, you don't need them. You've got facilitators and umpires checking that people are following the rules and not sticking the football underneath their sweater to run up the field. But when you have a sponsor objective and the adjudicators are looking at what blue does, looking at what red does and saying, yeah, it's not impossible. It's a low probability, but it's feasible that the aircraft carrier would sink when this missile come in. And the sponsor wants to know how you'd fight the war when your aircraft carrier has sunk. Guess what's going to happen that move? Okay, so the controllers are making decisions. Now, they can be unethical in the way they make those decisions. They can decide, no, I'm a Navy guy, and they're discussing up the hill funding between Navy and Air Force. And the last thing we want is to show, as has happened after games in which aircraft carriers have suffered, have someone waving the results of that sinking in front of congressmen. So yeah, there's fundamentally different ethical issues driven by, as Ruby's pointed out, the motivations. Players are motivated to play. They may also be playing in the outer game. Mm-hmm. I've listened to a general, I won't say which service, I've listened to a general directing his subordinates who are going to go and play in a game to absolutely don't worry about winning the military objectives inside the game. But even if you have to lose, make sure that your decisions make our preferred concepts look good and theirs look bad. That's a general officer with flags telling people to lie. Okay. Yeah. There you have an ethical issue. Okay, I'm done.
All right, thank you. Question 2 has to do with deception. So where do you draw the line between deception versus self-deception via bias? As in the studies of how tall people often get more votes, right? So I don't know if anybody wants to tackle that first.
Oh, yes. So self-deception and bias are the other person's fault. The ethics issue comes into how you exploit that. Okay, so people people have their cognitive biases. If I know what they are, and especially if I've done an investigation of the individuals in the game, And so I know that somebody has a tendency, and I can then exploit that. Now, if I'm a player, I'm red playing against blue, and I know that blue has a tendency to be risk averse or something, I can exploit that ethically. I'm just fighting them. It's a war. You know, I mean, we spend a lot of time trying to understand the personalities of our enemies. On the other hand, if I'm the game designer or the adjudicator, and I'm setting up questions for a final plenary, and I know that a biases or a self-deception qualities of a particular senior officer in the plenary, I can work out which questions and which order of the questions to put them in to exploit that person's biases or his self-deceptive tendencies. Over.
Yeah, I think that that's all very true. I also think that that when we're talking about deception, deliberate deception, whether it's in the part of game designers, members of the community, sponsors, players, facilitators, you know, that is something that we have to tackle head on through awareness of the techniques that Stephen's talking about. When we talk about implicit bias, that's something that we have to look at and develop principles and techniques so that we can determine whether or not that's going on, and do trainings and do whatever mitigations we can do to interrupt those, unless they are part of the realistic play. You know, like we don't want to make the inside of games a perfectly just experience, because that's not the world. We want to make the outside of games as just as we can.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we're going to turn to that great acronym BOGSATS. Okay, the first thing was there's actually a couple of comments. We've kind of turned into questions. I'm going to reverse the order just so the controller, the producer knows. The first one had to do with, shouldn't we be calling BOGSATS BOGGSATS or BOG2SATS for bunches of guys and girls sitting around a table? That's how I've seen it portrayed the last couple of years. This is not life and death, but certainly in light of the Derby House rules and so forth, yep, we should probably be thinking about that and making sure our terminology guides are updated.
Well, I'll fall back on being English. And when I rolled in the door in 1983 at Carnegie Mellon University, the students were all using the word guy to mean guy or gal. Hey, you guys, a girl would say, and there'd be guys and gals sitting in the room, and they'd all respond. So I fell into that habit. But some of the misunderstandings were extraordinary, especially those around when I went into the supply office, and I was looking for what I later discovered were called erasers.
Indeed. That's a cultural difference for sure. So I guess there's a few things to say about that. One, I know that there are probably people in the world who roll their eyes at the idea that we need to change terminology to be more inclusive, because it doesn't matter. But the fact of the matter is that there's been a lot of cognitive research that shows that it does matter. Mm-hmm. Solving the problem by adding an extra G doesn't actually solve the problem, because as we know, for a couple of reasons. One, girls is not really what I would like to be called, or what most adult women would like to be called. And secondly, if you've learned that terminology with guys in it, then it's actually gonna bring up, the association of guys, whatever those associations might be. But also, gender, we are acknowledging increasingly that there are non-binary people, that gender is a spectrum, and so adding an extra letter doesn't solve it that way. But also, do we really need more acronyms? I mean,
this one's actually been around for a while. I would actually offer BOPSAT for a bunch of people sitting around a table. Maybe
we could do BOPSAT, or I like Stephen's, arm waving one. But at the end of the day, what you're talking about is an unproductive meeting, and sometimes I think that just calling them a bunch of unproductive committee meetings is more effective.
Maybe it would deter people from holding them if people just put unproductive in the title.
Right? It just does what it says on the tin. It is an unproductive, unstructured meeting with bad process.
There we go. So this other comment was, it said about BOGSATs, the tendency is to have a well-educated bunch of bogs. The idea of a, quote, mob mentality in a bog sat may not apply so much. However, even the well-educated on any topic may get overheated. So
I gotta say, Stephen and I are gonna probably come up with the same thing, which is that education does not protect you from groupthink, and it doesn't protect you from wasting your time. Like, I have been in $30,000 meetings or $50,000 meetings, where it was a colossal waste of all our time because there wasn't good process, because there was groupthink, because there hadn't been thoughtful facilitation. I mean, and I think Stephen's probably been in many of those as well.
Well, the ideal is go back to sort of a brainstorm. Forget bog sat, just sitting around and talking. Go back to a brainstorm, which keeps being pushed by the military. I have never been in a brainstorm that's lasted longer than 2 minutes. Because the fundamental rule of brainstorming of no analysis gets broken within 90 to 120 seconds when a senior person in the room grunts approval or grunts disapproval about an idea. Bang, you're done. Okay, all the juniors then pile on or avoid that idea. Yes, if you're rigorously disciplined, you can drive a brainstorm through, and you'll get a poorer quality product than if you did put the same amount of effort into a 3-phase normative process. And if you don't know what I'm talking about out there, whoever's listening, especially you senior guys, shame on you. Go and hit some books and learn about your processes that you should be using.
There are lovely facilitation trainings out there, and that's another thing. We can hire facilitators to help us do these things. I mean, good process, good meeting process leads to so much markedly better results. And you don't have to waste your time in meetings where nothing happens. You don't have to have the same meeting 4 times.
But you can use people's tendency and desire for bog sats and brainstorms. You can manipulate those and use them to get your ideas through using the techniques I've laid out, and which, by the way, are going to be written up extensively in the Unethical Wargaming Working Group report that'll come out sometime in September.
Cool.
I have to say, Stephen, being in the U.S. Intel community, the Intel community years ago, around the time of 9/11, went to structured analytic techniques, including structured brainstorming. Having done a lot of those, I've seen some that have been very productive. I've seen some that have just been horrible with lots of bias and people trying to game. Once people figured out how structured brainstorming worked, they began to game the system.
Oh, yes.
By getting allies in the audience and so forth. So you constantly have to be on guard as a facilitator, having facilitated some of these, having been, having not only the participants, but the organizer, the person who is your client, try to manipulate how the brainstorming is supposed to go. You constantly have to be on guard. It's never ending. So I have to agree with you there.
Well, there's a very interesting ethical sort of conundrum here. We say, well, we have this problem. We all know that we as individuals might not actually have the answer, and we ought to listen to other people. Hands up, everyone who agrees with that about themselves. Everyone's hand goes up. Hands up if you think this time you're wrong. No one's hands go up. It's like asking everyone in the room, write down if you think you're above average. And guess what? More than half of them put themselves as above average. They're wrong.
Well, it's interesting. Our next question goes to voting schemes. So it said the question is actually worded, is the voting scheme secret? If the seniors vote first, the juniors voting second may have their careers hang on how much they agree if their seniors, if done openly. And I've often wondered this about matrix games, where you do the voting in matrix games, and people are kind of watching to see if they're holding up a green card or red card. So what do you both think?
If you're going to use voting, it should be done not just because you have senior and junior people in the room, but you want to have independence of opinion. One of the 4 criteria for wisdom of crowds to actually work is the final vote has to be done privately. You write it down, you put it in the bucket.
Yeah.
Ruby?
Yeah, well, absolutely, and simultaneous voting, because this is something that I think the American primary system, and then actually American voting announcements can I mean, again, I don't speak for the American government, but but I do think we get that wrong, right? Because we have this bias as reports start coming in, and we have Super Tuesday and things like that. But like we have all these precursor things, and I mean, you see it happening. You see the conversation starting to shift before people have put in their votes. And so, I mean, that's a very high stakes setting, but in war games, it's absolutely true. In meetings, it's true. If you want to manipulate a meeting, you have two people with slightly different perspectives fight, and then the one sort of the devil's advocate shill go, oh, okay, well, now I see what you're saying, and suddenly it seems like the tide is changing. You can do a lot with momentum in voting that is very, very dangerous if you want to get to good outcomes or neutral, unbiased outcomes.
If you're in any kind of meeting in which alternatives need to be racked and stacked, it could be alternate designs for your war game, it could be alternate colors to execute, it could be anything, and someone starts trying to put up a voting scheme, you're in trouble. Voting is great for having a violent, free transition of power, or it was until recently. Anyway, that's its objective. It is not a way of analyzing the goodness or badness of alternatives for a decision. It absolutely isn't. Go and read about Kenneth Arrow's impossibility theorem. The only possible voting situation in which you can guarantee a sort of good outcome is if there are only two alternatives.
Right.
3 or more, and you can manipulate them, and there is no conceivable voting scheme in which it is not possible to manipulate the outcome with 3 or more alternatives.
We have time for one more quick question, and we'll go with that. And the question is, where would you put and not put the sponsor in game development? For example, many believe having the general at each step gives him or her more buy-in to the game. Is it top-down or bottom-up or both? It's a long question. You have to wait for it to scroll across the screen there. But basically, where would the sponsor go, especially if it's a very senior person?
I know that there's some philosophy around agile development that suggests that having your sponsor in your meetings is a great idea. In my experience, most sponsors don't know very much about game design, and having them watch the sausage being made results in just terrible ideas. I mean, I even have this too, and hopefully they're not all watching, but I even have this sometimes within our own design group at the lab, where people who aren't specialists in game mechanics design come in and say, oh, well, we should do X, Y, and we should add these 4 mechanics, and also let's do this in 3 different groups. You have to go, whoa, like, you want to keep a minimum level of complexity so your players can play the game. We can't do all the things. And fortunately within our group, we have the ability to say that. But when you're talking about a sponsor, particularly a sponsor who, may be quite senior and used to getting their way by ordering other people to do it, I don't think that that's the best idea. I think that you explain your principles, you find out what their objectives are, you do a good requirements solicitation about what they need the game to do, and then you show them what choices you made and roughly why you made those choices, but you don't put them in the middle. That sounds like a terrible idea. But Stephen has much more experience, so I'll defer to him.
It's good to have the sponsor sort of with buy-in, and you get that by the initial meeting with the sponsor. And we boiled it down to sort of 4 questions. What do you want? And you never argue with that. You just tell you what he wants. 9 times out of 10, it's not actually a gameable problem. It's the problem of implementing a half-baked solution to a problem that the sponsor hasn't told you about. So this is why you have this meeting. What do you want? Why do you want it? That's commander's intent. This language mimics the military planning. And then, critically, why don't you have it? If this is something you want and you've got good reasons, why don't you already have it? That starts giving you some of the barriers. And then the final question, how long are you in your current position for, sir or ma'am? because that tells you how long you've got to do the project. If it's a 6-month project and he's rotating out in 3 months, don't bother. Or you've got a 2-month, you cut the project down to a 2-month one. So those 4 questions. The worst case is you haven't properly drilled down on the 2nd and 3rd question. The sponsor then vanishes because he's real busy, and an action officer who doesn't really know what they're talking about steps in. The action officer, so if that happens, you have to make clear the action officer can make decisions on behalf of the general. You don't have to keep going back. And if you do have to keep going back, you just keep pushing the deliverable date. Again, it's a matter of ethics. What you don't want to do is have poorly defined objectives because the sponsor came in for a 20-minute conversation and left. The action officer keeps flailing. You hold the timetable to the same time. You deliver a bad game that doesn't actually address the real, because in the 6 months or 2 months or whatever that you've been working and gaming, the sponsor who gave you vague, half thought through objectives has firmed up his or her objectives, but you don't know what they are.
Right.
All right.
And that hurts not only you and the relationship with the sponsor, but it hurts the community.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Because people think, oh, well, games can't be applied to these problems. They don't see those operational difficulties. They don't see the politics and the struggle. They just see the fact that the game didn't work.
Right. Do we still have people on YouTube watching?
We have no more questions, unless you have any final comments. There was one, somebody did ask, I believe, in the feed about the book you mentioned. Apparently they didn't catch it, so I don't know if you just want to go into the feed after and type the information in.
Oh, you mean over in Discord?
Over in Discord after. So
I'll do that. I'll do that.
Okay.
All right. So unless anyone has anything else, we are done for this. Well, at least for Ruby for this morning. And thank you very much for an enjoyable panel discussion. And it was outstanding. So any last words from either of you?
Well, thank you, Ruby. It's great to meet you, and
Yes.
I will track you down. Is your email inside the system somewhere?
Yeah, it is, absolutely. And yes, absolutely. I would love to talk more. And this has been a real pleasure. Thank you all for having us, and thanks, folks, for watching. So have a lovely day, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.